River animal adaptations. Animals that live in the river have very difficult living environments because of the water. Because water is wet, animals that live in the river have to have special adaptations to help them survive when they're in the water. An adaptation is a change made by a plant or an animal in response to their environment. These changes help the animal to survive better. They can be a physical or behavioral change, but they happen over a long period of time. One example of a physical adaptation in an animal is their outer covering. So this muskrat is a mammal, and he has fur. He has fur that helps him to become more waterproof, so the water doesn't actually get through his fur and get to his skin because he would get cold. Beavers also have very waterproof fur because they have a second layer of fur that's very tight against their skin. So the top layer, or the overcoat, allows the water to run off of their body, and the second layer closer to their body, the undercoat, keeps them warm and dry and prevents their skin from getting wet. The waterproof fur helps the muskrat and the beaver to stay warm in the water, especially in the winter when the water can become very, very cold. Mammals are warm-blooded animals, and that means that their temperature stays the same no matter what the temperature is outside, so their outer coverings have to help keep them warm. An otter is another example of a mammal. Otters have very thick fur that's covered in oil to help them stay waterproof too. You can see how the otter's fur is super shiny. That's because of all the oil on his fur. If you take a minute and explore the beaver fur, the muskrat fur, and the otter fur, you'll be able to see the similarities in how their fur keeps them warm and dry. Birds like these ducks also have oils that they spread over their feathers from a gland on the back of their tail. Ducks are always in the water, so their feathers have to keep them completely dry, somewhat like the mammal's fur keeps them dry. They take their beak and they spread those oils over their feathers so that they can continue to stay in the water without getting cold. Birds' feathers are also designed to keep the water from getting through the feathers, and it rolls right off of the feathers back into the river. Birds have different types of feathers for different purposes. One type of feather is smooth and keeps the water from coming onto their bodies, and the other type of feather is called a downy feather that keeps them warm and is up pressed against their skin to keep their bodies from getting cold. The type of feather that keeps the water from getting onto their bodies is called a contour feather, and those feathers are designed like Velcro. If you take a feather and mess it up and then smooth it back out again, it'll come right back together to keep that water from getting to the body of the bird. You can see that on the feather in your kit. Turtles are reptiles, and they are an example of a cold-blooded animal. So their body temperature stays the same as the air temperature around them, and it changes when it gets cold. So when it gets really cold, they have to stop moving. When they stop moving, it's called hibernation, and that's a behavioral adaptation that we'll cover later. The physical adaptation of reptiles that makes the biggest difference for them are the scales on their outsides of their bodies. The scales help to protect them from the water and keep the water that's inside of their bodies inside of them so they don't lose the water or dehydrate. Amphibians, or frogs, have no scales. They only have skin. So that skin needs to stay moist for them to be able to survive. If they're out of the water for too long, their skin will dry out and they can't survive like that. This crayfish has an exoskeleton on the outside of his body. So he's covered in a shell that covers his entire body and allows him to be able to be out of the water as well as inside of the water. Other adaptations that help animals to survive in the water are their feet and their legs. Animals that live in the water have webbed feet so that they can swim better by using the webbing between their toes to push against the water and move forward better than if they didn't have the webbing. These are animals that swim in the water, like ducks and geese and beavers. Beavers only have webbing on their back feet. Their back feet are used to help them to swim better, and their front feet are used to help them to hold on to their food. Animals that don't swim in the water, but just stand in the water, like this great blue heron, have very long toes and large feet that help them to stand very still in the water while they wait for their food to swim between their legs. Great blue herons fool the fish by making their legs look like sticks, so that when the fish swim between their legs, the great blue heron uses its long neck and its pointy beak to reach down and catch the fish while it's swimming right between its legs. Another type of adaptation that animals that live in water have are their tails. Beavers have very unique tails that they use as a rudder to help them swim better, but also they use their tails to help prop them up while they're sitting. When they are chewing on a tree, their tails help them to get farther up the tree to chew that tree down so it falls into the water. Fish also use their tails to help them swim by moving their tails side to side. Their bodies are also streamlined and skinny to help propel them through the water better. Kind of like this diving duck, a merganser, that dives down into the water. It has a very streamlined or skinny body that helps it to be able to dive down and get through the water faster to be able to catch the fish underneath the water. Another adaptation that animals have for living underneath the water are their eyes. Their eyes are covered with a layer of mucus, a protective layer that helps them to be able to keep their eyes open underneath the water. Fish use that protective layer to help them to survive under the water, and they never have to blink. Fish even sleep with their eyes open. Mammals like the beaver have a third eyelid that's clear and allows them to swim underneath the water and see where they're going, and the eyelid protects their eyes from the water. Beavers also have valves in their ears, kind of like earplugs, so when they swim underneath the water doesn't get inside of their ears. Because they are mammals, beavers have to breathe air out of the water, but animals like fish breathe the air that's in the water through gills on the sides of their bodies. Crayfish breathe through gills as well. They have gills that line the side of their body and allow them to take the oxygen out of the water and process that oxygen just like we would, but they do it through their gills. They can also breathe out of the water because their shell keeps their bodies from drying out. As long as they have moisture along their gills, they can continue to breathe even when they're out of the water. So all of the adaptations we've talked about so far were structural adaptations. But now we're going to discuss a few behavioral adaptations, or adaptations that animals do to survive. Migration is one of those adaptations. Migration is when an animal can't find their food here in the wintertime, so they are forced to move south. Mostly we see this in animals that fly, like geese and ducks. Another form of behavioral adaptation is hibernation. That's when the animal's bodies pretty much completely shut down for the entire winter. Frogs will hide under the mud in the water, and sometimes snakes will do that as well. Snakes will also hide in holes underneath the ground, or sometimes they'll hide in a pile of rocks. When they're hibernating, their body temperature becomes the same as the air around them, so they have to protect themselves from being exposed to the frigid temperatures of winter with snow and cold. When animals hibernate, they barely breathe, their body temperature goes way down, and they hardly have a heartbeat. But cold-blooded animals start to come out of hibernation with warm sun. Other animals, like turtles, become dormant in the wintertime, where they're only active when it becomes warmer. Some turtles live underneath the ice in the river, and they'll actually move around, but very, very slowly because the river water is so cold. Turtles that live underneath the water have a special adaptation that helps them to breathe while they're under the water. They're able to capture the oxygen out of the water by simply passing the water over different parts of their skin. Finally, the last form of animal adaptations for behaviors are animals that stay active in the winter, like this otter. Animals that are active in the winter have an extra layer of fat on their bodies in the winter, and they get a thicker coat of fur to help them to stay warm in the snow. As you can see, these otters are playing in the snow, and they don't get cold at all. Ultimately, all of these adaptations we've talked about today are to help the animals survive in water and in a river habitat. Without having these special adaptations, these animals wouldn't be able to survive with the water being around them all the time and the cold that comes with being in water.